Here's a question. What does Athol Wharf, Chatswood Railway Station and Balmoral Beach all have in common? Yeah, they're all the termini for the Balmoral Beach Tramline. Okay, the title of this video probably gave that one away. I'm Marty, and welcome back to BackTracks. And that's what we'll discuss today, the story of the Balmoral Beach Tramline. But firstly, let's put the line in context of the whole system. The North Sydney lines of the Sydney tramway system were independent of the main system, which was basically all on the southern side of Sydney Harbour. Prior to the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, public transport between the south side and the north side of Sydney Harbour was provided by ferry service between Circular Quay and various wharves, like this one at Milsons Point, most of which were then served by connecting tram services. When the Harbour Bridge was opened in 1932, the North Sydney lines were reorientated from primarily connecting to ferry wharves to tram lines that crossed the bridge and terminated on the southern side of the harbour at Wynyard. Let's talk about the Balmoral lines. In 1886, the first tram to run on Sydney's North Shore was a cable tram that ran from Milsons Point to the top of Ridge Street in North Sydney. This line was then extended to Spit Junction along Military Road in 1893 using an electric tram, and then in 1917 it was extended to Taronga Zoo and Athol Wharf, and then finally the line from Balmoral was opened as a branch line off the Georges Heights line in May 1922. And this was one of the last tram lines to be opened in Sydney. There were two main routes that serviced Balmoral Beach, a long cross-system run from Chatswood Railway Station, and then there was a shorter line that started at Athol Wharf, today what's called Taronga Zoo Wharf. It went up to the zoo's top gates, then via King Mac Street, and then started a descent down to Balmoral Beach through a winding reservation. More on that later. So let's have a look at the line in reverse from Balmoral to Athol Wharf. The line started at Balmoral Beach at the Esplanade terminus at the corner of Mandalong Road. The original tram shed at Balmoral still exists today, and there's a quaint little plaque celebrating the time that the line existed. The shed is still a terminus for a number of bus routes, such as bus route 238, which does a similar run to the original tram. And I was speaking with the driver, and unlike trams on the route which was stabled at North Sydney Depot, his bus was operated out of the Brookvale Depot. Once trams left the terminus, they travelled south along the Esplanade. And here's a picture taken before the promenade was built. And this second one was after it was constructed, and that's the promenade that still remains there today. After Botanic Road, the line swung right into Henry Plunkett Reserve. And from this point, the line went into a reservation through the bush and ascended uphill, travelling first through a narrow rock cutting, which is now a walking track. And thanks to the Sydney Tramway Museum, there are a number of tram-related items placed in the cutting to commemorate the line that once existed here. Like they've relayed a short section of track, a little plaque explaining that the line once ran there, a rosette holding electric wires, a brake shoe, and also then a handbrake. And in researching this, I also discovered that soon after the line was closed, it obviously became quieter, and then it was known as Lover's Lane for a number of years. The walking track continues along what was then a steep ascent through the reserve. And at that point, it gets quite interesting as the line crossed several small residential streets along the way. When the line was closed, parts of the track reservation were just converted to a few housing blocks. So there are some very uniquely shaped blocks that took up the shape of the former tram line. Now here's an aerial view from the 1940s that shows the former path of the line in detail. And then a more recent Google Maps view that shows where the houses are now situated. The tram line then crossed here where the cul-de-sac and turning circle is today, passed through the front yard of this house, and then basically travelled along the line of this driveway. The line then continued through the bottom of Gordon Street before coming back onto Plunkett Road. So today there are 4 houses that trace the line of the former track. After the tram crossed Plunkett Road, it then swept up through Plunkett Reserve. You can clearly see the path the tram would have taken through the park. Once it got through the park, the tram then continued to travel uphill along Beaconsfield Road. Then it swung right through Wolseley Road and then back onto Gordon Street to finish its rise to the top. Once at the top, it turned into Middle Head Road, where it joined the existing Georges Heights line. That line opened in August 19 to service the military hospital that was there at the time in the Georges Heights barracks. That line was closed in 1925. Now, for the first few years, trams from Balmoral then had to join the main line at a point where Bradley's Head Road, Military Road and Middle Head Road met. That is today the roundabout in front of the Buona Vista Hotel. But to save that roundabout way of getting to the zoo, an extension linking the Balmoral and Zoo lines was opened through King Mac Street in December 1923. That directly linked to Bradley's Head Road. Then the tram travelled downhill past the top gates of Taronga Zoo before it continued into Athol Wharf Road. Now, if you haven't been to the zoo, it's a pretty special place. It was actually first opened in 1884 on a site on the southern side of Sydney. Taronga Zoo moved to its current site in October 1916. Enough of the zoo, back to the trams. The line from Balmoral to the zoo was basically double-tracked all the way, but the rest of the journey down to Athol Wharf was really a single line, with a passing loop at Ashton Park and then also at the terminus. Interestingly, from about 1929, the loop actually wasn't required for operations, but trams continued to use both tracks until the closure of the line. The tram timetable was generally set to meet the ferries at Athol Wharf. At peak times, ferries arrived every 20 minutes at Athol Wharf, but more often it was on a 30-minute service. Sometimes up to 3 or 4 trams would be waiting for the ferry to run different routes, maybe just to the top gates of the zoo, to Balmoral Beach, or to Chatswood. Now, tram operators knew how many trams should be at the bottom of the hill each time, so they would put a stone on top of the staff box outside the top gates of the zoo to indicate that their tram had already gone down. Loss of control by the driver on this descending grade was a constant danger, especially when leaves from the trees combined with rain or dew to make the wheels skid when the brakes were applied. Runaway trams plunged into the harbour in 1942, 1952 and the last in 1958. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that Chatswood was the other termini of the Balmoral Beach line, and that was the longest continuous journey in length and time, nearly an hour, of the whole North Sydney system. Once the tram got up onto Military Road, it then travelled along Falcon Street, and then Chatswood services turned into Willoughby Road and eventually terminated at Chatswood Railway Station at Victoria Avenue terminus. Now, the Balmoral line was one of the last trams to run on the North Shore system when the whole system was closed in 1958. Well, there you have it, another tale of Sydney's lost tramways on BackTracks. Please like and subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you again when we take another look at Sydney's lost tramways.